I mean, it was the dark ages. I mean, we thought it was Cracker Jack, but it was the dark ages. And here's another one that'll blow your mind. We didn't lock the narcotic cupboard, nor did we count narcotics, because nobody ever dared walk through those double doors because they just weren't welcome there.
Clock in, scrub up, and join us behind the red line. You're listening to First Case, a perioperative podcast bringing you exciting interviews, engaging discussions, and innovative solutions that are changing the way patients receive surgical care. Each episode, we talk to frontline staff, perioperative leadership, and nursing entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the back table to the boardroom, from wheels in to wheels out, we tackle the real-life issues affecting the OR. Whether you're tuning in for surgical service education or inspiration, we're glad you're here. And now, it's time to roll back and start the first case.
This week on First Case, we speak with Monica Weisbrich. Monica is a true native Californian born and raised in Los Angeles. She graduated from Catholic Girls High School in 1952 and entered St. Vincent College of Nursing, graduating in 1955 as a diploma registered nurse. Upon graduation, she began her nursing career as a staff nurse in the operating room in a brand new 99-bed nonprofit hospital in the South Bay area of Los Angeles, and later achieved the role of nursing director of the OR. After 20 years, Monica changed her practice environment and went to work in a 500-bed nonprofit hospital. This change showed and taught her many different aspects of healthcare and its delivery system. It was during this time that she obtained a baccalaureate in nursing. She left acute care and entered the business world of healthcare to manage a nurse-owned and nurse-managed supplemental staffing agency for perioperative, post-anesthesia, and GI lab nurses for over half of California. This change afforded her yet another side of healthcare and the patient care delivery systems. Later, Monica changed paths and became a consultant, and she remained true to the perioperative arena, which opened a variety of doors for potential clients, perioperative vendors, the space program, schools of nursing, office practice, and acute care. Over the course of her career, Monica received many awards and honors, including the Award of Excellence in Perioperative Nursing from the Los Angeles chapter of AORN in 1988, the Award for Outstanding Achievement in State Council Leadership from AORN in 2010, Best Practice, Retention, Recruitment, and Outreach from ACNL in 2012, Friend of Nursing from ACNL in 2013, and Mentor Leadership Advocate, ACNL 2019. And I am going to tell you, you are in for a treat today. Cat's out of the bag. We've already interviewed Monica, and you're getting the introduction to what has been one of the great joys of my podcasting career. I cannot tell you how much I enjoyed this, and we can't wait to share it with you, the listening audience. So, Jeremy, this is going to be a great one.
Yes, Justin, I'm really excited for everyone to get to hear Monica's interview. You know, it's really unique that she has had the opportunity to see the operating room and its evolution throughout the years, both from what it took to become an OR nurse then and what it takes to maintain that today. So just a really unique opportunity for us to look at the operating room and how it has evolved over the years.
So get ready for some perspective. We're going to be right back with Monica Weisbrich after a short break.
You're listening to the First Case podcast.
Joining us now is Monica Weisbrich. And Monica, we're here to talk today about your quite long and illustrious career in nursing and surgery, and it began back in 1955. And so we are so excited to talk to you about the evolution of surgery throughout the course of your career. And I happen to know that you and Paul go way back quite a while. So I'm also hoping that you will tell us some stories about Paul that maybe he'd prefer you not.
Not fair, not fair.
Well, Paul, why don't you tee this up? Because I know you and Monica have a great relationship. I'd love for you to set the table on this week's episode.
Well, thanks, Justin. Monica was actually my mentor when I first got into leadership in the OR back in the late 80s. And I learned so much from her. And one of the things I learned the most is you got to be able to laugh at what you do. And then just hearing all the stories about when she first started in the OR. Amazingly, Monica started working in the OR when I was 2 years old. And,
Paul.
and I worked in the OR for 44 years. So that tells you how far back she goes into this business. So, and I just would love to share some of her stories with everybody. So Monica, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you saw when you first went into the OR? What kind of technology did they have? I mean, what was it like working in there in the very beginning?
Well, first of all, Paul, I decided that the only thing that was decent about nursing was the operating room. And I decided that while I was a student. So I just blatantly walked in and said, I want to work in the operating room. And they went, oh, okay. And that's right out of school, no experience whatsoever. And so you want to know what the operating room was like when I first started? Well, it was perfect. I didn't know any better. I mean, it was truly, truly perfect. And now when we started talking about perhaps doing this podcast, I thought about just a couple things, like there was no plastic in the world at that time. And all of our drapes and stuff, those were cloth. And the IV bottles were glass. I mean, it's been a terrific evolution from the beginning to where we are now. And a lot of it was helpful. I mean, I can remember sitting around sharpening needles before you put them into a little tube to send them down to be sterilized. It's just many, many little things like that you just keep going and going.
So nothing was disposable at all? I mean,
no.
Sharpening needles. So is this like for syringes or for sutures or
Correct.
both?
No, correct. For sharpening them for syringes and powdering the surgeon's gloves to send them down to be sterilized. I mean, it was the dark ages. I mean, we thought it was Cracker Jack, but it was the dark ages. And here's another one that'll blow your mind. We didn't lock the narcotic cupboard, nor did we count narcotics, because nobody ever dared walk through those double doors because they just weren't welcome there. So it was that, from a nursing standpoint, from an equipment standpoint, from a technical standpoint, it was all just beginning. I mean, really just beginning. And it was kind of fascinating. It's more fascinating looking back on it.
So Monica, I just have a question about, as you talk about all these changes that have occurred over the years, can you tell us a little bit about how you adjusted? I mean, that's a very significant change to what we're used to today. And I know you've retired, but you faced a lot of changes throughout your career. Can you talk to us how you dealt with that change, and as a leader, how you led those changes?
Well, when it very, very first started with the changes, it was very physician-surgeon. Remember, surgeon driven downward. They would either read an article in one of their journals or something and come and say, this is what we've got to do. And you would say, oh, all right. And then you just go get whatever it was they needed and implemented it. There was no research behind it. There was best practices, wasn't even in the vocabulary in those years. You just did what the surgeon did. Or what they wanted. There was none of the budgeting like goes on today and any kind of accountability for the money that you would spend. But it worked out okay because we still were having good patient outcomes. There wasn't the concrete data like we have now, or the research, the depth of the research that we have now. So it was a little different then. But nobody seemed to mind. The surgeons would go, we need this. Oh, okie dokie. And away you went. And we implemented it and it worked. So it was, I think, a lot of luck.
Monica, talking about luck, you said you went right into the OR when you got out of nursing school, which I followed that pattern as well. But how did you get trained? How did they train you back in those days? Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, somebody did show me how to scrub, okay? And in those days, you did the 10-minute thing. But basically, it was a buddy thing. They would let you scrub. See, there were no technicians then. It was all nurses. So you were partnered with a nurse, an older, experienced nurse, who would show you the way. And then there was nothing formal. I mean, there was no rationale to why we scrubbed for 10 minutes, why we put our gloves on the way we did, or why we took them off the way we did at the end of the case. But it just was that. And then the rest was learning, I believe, by what was tenderly called the school of hard knocks. You made the mistake once, but boy, you never did it again.
I'll bet. How long did it take you to feel comfortable working in the OR after your training? How long of a period of time was it?
Well, I can tell you that from the time I started till the time I felt comfortable when I was asked to assume the head, at that time it was called head nurse role, was 10 years. That's a long time.
Yeah.
But by that time, see, we didn't have any specialties. You had a craniotomy, you did it. You had a tonsillectomy, you did it. It was all over the spectrum of what we did in the operating room. We had one children's hospital. When we first started, there was no UCLA. There was a lot and USC's hospital was called the Big County. So it wasn't even private like it is now. It really was a different world. I mean, it was evolving, but yeah, it was amazing.
That's so interesting. You didn't have specialties. Of course, when I started in the OR, I started on the orthopedics team, which is where I wanted to be. But to think about the level of skill you have to develop to go from a craniotomy to a tonsillectomy.
Amazing, isn't it? And in both roles, circulating or scrubbing. You just didn't think a thing about it. You just did it.
So with both nurses in the room, did y'all rotate? How did you do your assignments in those?
I'm not really, well, basically when we walked in the room, it was, what do you want to do? And usually nurses, it's not that we played favorites or anything, but we did have our favorite surgeons that we liked. So if you liked them, you would scrub. If you didn't like him, you would circulate. And it was as simple as that. And then when it was my turn to make the assignments, I just put two nurses. After a while, you know which ones are pretty good at this and pretty not very good, maybe at neuro or something. And I would just put the two of them in there and just tell them you can do whatever you want. As long as the case goes fine and I don't hear any feedback that things were terrible, do what you want. And that's what they did.
That is really neat and really just shows a level of cooperation that sometimes we don't see in the OR.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell a tale. We had a general surgeon, who was, oh, golly, everyone just was dying to work with him. And so I was trying to figure out how to rotate the nurses so they don't inadvertently get stuck with them day after day. So we implemented a list. And only the staff knew about it. The surgeons didn't. And then when you scrubbed for him, then that day you came out and just put a little check by your name, and I would know that you were on the gold star list and don't put you there the next day. And I am telling you, we had one surgeon 6 months driving me crazy trying to figure out what the gold star list was and how a person could get on it. And we never ever told.
That's fun.
Well, you have to be kind of innovative when you're the boss sometimes back there.
For sure. I want to ask you a little bit about the specialties. Back then, there was not as much instrumentation as there is today. I would assume, right?
No, absolutely not.
So how did you determine and even sterilization? I mean, how many of each kind of tray did you have to do a particular kind of case, and how many specialty trays were there versus general instrument trays?
I'm sitting kind of groping thinking about this. I know we had stuff for vaginal work. Those were those kind of trays, and we had some. And then, but to tell you the exact number, Paul, I don't think I could do that, but I know we had like tonsil stuff. And then we would have, for some reason or other, like the hernias, we figured out we didn't have to put so much stuff in that, instruments in that to get the job done as you would for hysterectomy or gallbladder. And I think it just kind of evolved really with the school of hard knocks. And then everything got crazy after there was open heart and there were joint replacements. And the intraocular lens, that was another little one. So you had to do some thinking and do things differently and schedule. Actually, assignments were different then too.
So let's talk about something else for a second here.
Okay.
Preoperative and postoperative patient care. What was it like when you first started in terms of when would a patient come to the hospital? How long would they stay afterwards? What were the parameters back in those days?
Well, I think what you have to do is split it up as to before Medicare and after Medicare. Because before Medicare, they just came in, spent the night, and depending on what the surgeon's little idiosyncrasies were, what kind of lab work they had and stuff, they did sign consents. And we did have, the surgeon did need to identify his patient at the front desk before it went down. Okay, and that was pretty much it. And then Medicare came along, and then you got to play the Medicare game. Everybody up to, what was it, over 35, you had to have a chest x-ray, and over 40 or something, you had EKGs. You could never have just a hemoglobin. You had to have a complete CBC because it was all paid for by Medicare. And so that then changed the whole thing for a checklist, kind of a checklist before it to make sure that the quote-unquote chart was complete. And the identification process at the front desk got a little bit more sophisticated so that we weren't making mistakes and getting the wrong patient in the wrong room. So you split it. And then when we moved on into the DRGs, and that was in the 80s somewhere, or late 70s, early 80s, they started clumping not fee for service, but what the hospitals would get paid. That changed things again. And then the chest x-rays, the EKGs, and all those little things started diminishing as far as requirements were concerned. So there was a lot of game playing with fee for service. I think it's a nice way to put that.
Do you think that the changes were driven more by the payer, or was it a combination of payer and research and patient outcomes?
Truthfully, LBJ is the one that put Medicare in. And I believe that this was an absolutely pure political saving the humanity process that LBJ believed in. And he implemented it and didn't fund it. And so it's been an interesting life with Medicare as we've gone along from, I believe, if I remember correctly, was that not 1964?
That's correct.
Well, it's just a fact. But it has affected a lot of stuff. Yeah. Because I can tell you that when they first started coming out with like joint replacements and the open heart, and you'd have all the intraocular lenses, even very simple things, and then you tried to get a code, a CMS code, in order to do the correct fee for service for that procedure. It took 4 years to get a new code on the CMS booklet or whatever you want to call it. Yeah. It was interesting. And the regular staff nurse didn't understand it. They understand it much better now than they did before because it gave the appearance of dollars overtaking patient care. And so then that started some little lack of coordination, would be a nice way to put it, between administration and the medical staff and the nursing staff.
So, Monica, we were talking a little bit about technology when you first started, and I'd like to hear from you. What was the technology like in the operating room when you first started, and how has it evolved over the years? When did you start to see technology coming into play?
Well, at the very, very beginning, Paul, you started with a patient on an operating room. At that time, we called it table, but an operating room bed. And there was an anesthesia machine. There was a cautery, not in every room, cautery not in every room yet. And there was a Mayo stand and a back table and 2 splash basins. That was it. Basically, they really didn't have heart monitors on their machines yet. And so it was manual blood pressure, and pulse was just put your finger up on the neck and see if there was a pulse. And that was it. And then very slowly, the monitoring that anesthesia used grew. And it grew quite a bit so that the heart was taken care of, the lung part was taken care of, all those physiology components for anesthesia were taken care of that way. And then in came equipment, depending on what the procedure was, that was very specific for that procedure. And then that did grow huge because we had heart programs, we had ophthalmology that grew like you couldn't believe, and then ortho. It was kind of amazing. And about in that time was when they removed the cesarean section from the operating room and sent it up to OB. So some of the equipment that we had there for the babies was just removed and sent up to OB.
When I look back at my career, there's a definite demarcation between in technology before robotics and after robotics came into the OR. One other thing that I think is very significant in the OR was going from an open procedure to a laparoscopic procedure. Can you talk a little bit about those challenges that you faced when you made those transitions?
Well, I think the biggest challenge is, at least for me and for somebody in an administrative role, so to speak, was the decision on whether this was really truly the most correct piece of equipment I should be purchasing for them, because they varied so. I mean, granted, the scopes and everything are pretty much fairly much the same, but when you got into the cameras and the microscopes and those kinds of things, it was a whole different world of what you needed to learn about that equipment before making your purchasing decisions. And it did change the way we booked cases, or we anticipated the length of the cases. At the very beginning, you had to have a backup setup completely in case they had to open up because they couldn't get everything done through the scope. So it wasn't troublesome, but it was just a uneasy period. Your confidence, saying, well, I'm going to go buy this piece of equipment, this endoscopy piece of equipment, and then you get it and you think, well, dear, that wasn't quite what he meant. So it was a troublesome time, and then it settled down. And it settled down both ways because the physicians learned how to use the equipment better, and the nurses knew how to respond to their needs and wants.
So what I take from that is the more things change in the operating room, the more they stay the same, because we faced the same challenges when we moved from laparoscopic procedures to robotic procedures. Exactly. Having all of the setup in the back and everything. I mean, it was the same mentality almost exactly.
Yeah. And it's very, very troublesome when you're a boss because you want things to be able to go easily and smoothly for your staff because they have enough to worry about. It was a very frustrating time. And I hear it from other fellow nurses about the conversion over to robotics is the same. I have not had that experience, so I can't discuss it.
Well, Monica, here's another question. I know you were talking about trying to determine which piece of equipment you should get. And part of that, I believe, I know I've heard a couple of stories from you about this over the years, about going to AORN to learn about the different pieces of equipment and stuff. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how AORN Expo, as it's called today, versus what it was like in the old days would be helpful. Or even the fact that when did AORN get started when you were working in the OR?
Oh, well, that one I can tell you for sure, because when I came as the Cracker Jack staff nurse straight out of school, my boss was a nun, and they had started AORN in New York the year before I came to work at the hospital, and they were going to have their second Congress, if you will, and it was going to be at the Biltmore Hotel downtown in Los Angeles, and Sister made us go. And I went, what are you talking about? So that was my first experience with AORN, and basically it had lots to do with, they had a lot of equipment out there presented to speak to us about and the vendors to teach you. But after that, well, for a while I took a little hiatus because I didn't belong to anything. And then I joined AORN again because I had a need to find out, and it was exactly that, about equipment. And at least you could go there and see the different brands, if you will, and then you could talk to the salesman there and have your questions answered and then come back and make better decisions when you got back to work. It was almost like a necessity to go to AORN, to their major Congress once a year. And I learned to lean on that. I mean, because you could go there and complain to the vendor because the guy that owns the company would be right there, that he could hear your, this happened. And then sometimes it got fixed and sometimes they got explained to you what you were doing wrong, which was helpful too.
What about disposable products? You were saying that you had to reuse everything when you first started. Actually, when I first started, as I recall, we were reusing lap sponges. The lap sponges would get put in with the linen and get washed and reused. Is that right? I mean, so that was 40 years ago, 40 some odd years ago. So I would imagine there was really nothing that was disposable. So how did that all get started? Like even with sutures and things?
Yeah, because when I started, the sutures were in glass. And then you stuck them in a jar. They were in a jar with this famous Bard Parker solution that was going to kill everything that flew by, And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, there were two major brands of sutures at that time. And I don't know how, a miracle of life, you could call it. But they then got rid of the glass and they then went to the paper, if you will, containers that suture are in now. We got rid of the glass and the bottles. And it's the same as with the IV. I mean, those glass bottles, when you lifted 1,000 cc's up to hang on an IV stand, that was a heavy little piece of equipment. But the drapes didn't come for a while. And then the drapes came, and so that was pretty cool. And then they had the packs. So they started making packs for, this is for a vag hysterectomy and this is for an abdominal. But the issue that happened was, unless you were really on your toes and paying attention to your inventory, you would find that there was things in the packs that you didn't need and other things that you needed to add. And so the pack issue is in my mind, inventory control debacle, so to speak. But it's just one of those things that is hard to keep track of. But at least you have packs that are specialized packs now.
When you talk about using reusable items, and it sounds like from what you were stating earlier, sharpening needles before you sent them down to sterile processing, the workload on the OR nurse and the scrub nurse must have been significantly different than it is today.
Well, it was different, but it isn't the pressure that it is now. The pressure that it is now is productivity. At the beginning, you didn't have that many cases. I mean, in a 6-room it was a 4-room when I first started there, operating room. If we had 6 cases, it was a big deal. So there was time to do these little chores, I used to call them. But yeah, and it's not like it is now. I mean, all you hear now is productivity and turnover time. Turnover. That's right. And if you'd leave us alone to let us do our work, we'd get the turnover really good. But the push, it gets you kind of a little hyper, I guess you could say. There was the time to do that stuff, and there was a lot more pitching in. Yeah.
So back in those days, I would imagine that the salary levels probably weren't as high as they are today.
Oh, no.
Maybe you could share with us what your starting salary was as an RN in the OR.
Well, I'll tell you, it was a very sore subject in our family because my sister had just graduated from high school and was working in the famous steno pool at Arco, which is a big gas place. And I'm the crackerjack perioperative, well, that word didn't even exist then, nurse. And I was making, you die at this, I was making $295 a month and she was making $325. And that was a very sore subject at our house, that my sister was making more money than I was as a staff nurse. But when I started, there was no overtime and you were on call, but you didn't get paid for it. You just did it for God and your country. And that lasted at least I think it lasted about 1.5 years before all of a sudden it dawned on us, hey, wait a minute, what is this? And then we rebelled and refused to do a case until we got paid for it. And it only took our administrator about 45 minutes to make a decision. And that was the beginning of call pay. Yeah.
Wow.
So I just did some quick math there. At $295 a month, that was $1.70 an hour. And that's not including call time.
Oh, yeah, we didn't have that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. It was amazing. But all I wanted to do was make a little bit more than my sister. But it evened out later on. We got things a little bit better financially.
I assume gas was still $2 a gallon, though.
Oh, yeah.
Only in California.
It was by the 70s, I'm pretty sure. Yeah.
There was a lot of carpooling. Oh, Lord. Anyway, yeah. But my personal opinion is at least finally nurses are making what they should be making, and they earn it. It's my feeling.
Absolutely. And I remember you're talking about a time when you started to get reasonable pay and benefits and just how all of the organization of it all came together. But I also remember, I want to kind of end on this question and get your take, because when I went to nursing school, the in-hospital programs pretty much were gone. And I remember in the 70s, there was such a shortage of nurses that that's really when those programs came about, was much more of a hands-on. And I remember a couple of things from my years in nursing school. One was we had a third of our class were men, which was the highest by a long shot of all of their classes to that point. And then the other thing I remember is that another third, including some of the men, dropped out their junior year when they actually started doing any kind of personal care. So we didn't have any hands-on until several years into it. And even now, if I'm asked, people will say, well, should I be a nurse or should I do nursing? And I say yes, but honestly, I would recommend you go get your associates first and make sure you like the work before you go and do the bachelor's. Plus, you never know, employer may be able to help you out with your schooling to finish out your bachelor's. I mean, if you love it, I suggest you definitely do that. But part of the reason I say this is because I just remember so many people just love the idea of nursing. But then when they got to the point of having the intimacy of nursing or the technical piece, and all of a sudden the realization that somebody's life might really depend on them, and their competency, a lot of different reasons, but so many people drop out. What is your thoughts on in-hospital based programs? Do you think that should be maybe more a part of the curriculum, or do you like where we've gone with a more academia standard bachelor's kind of degree as really being the emphasis for a lot of it?
Well, I'm a diploma grad. It's what we called ourselves generously. Now, I can only speak at that time for California. There was one baccalaureate program in the entire state, and that was at Stanford, and it was a 5-year program. Otherwise, and there were no AA programs at that time. There were just the diploma. And so, what do you know? And there were no males in any of the programs that I was familiar with. But we got to spend more time with the different, they had them categorized, into pediatrics. We had psych, and I'm not quite sure what they called, what with like all the infections and that kind of stuff that we took, communicable diseases, I guess. But I basically am a proponent of the baccalaureate right now. And I think in order to compete with anybody out in the job market for whatever profession, it has to be out there. I think they're going to have to go forward with the baccalaureate. I agree with you that there are many, many things that the program should have. Many experiences are missing, and I can speak mainly for California. The amount of hours that you must perform for each one of the PEDS, communicable disease, and all that are set down by the state, and the states control the Nursing Practice Act individually for each state. So what's good in California may not be good in New Jersey, or maybe it's better in New Jersey than it is in California. But that's what we have to live with, because that's been set up since I don't know how long ago on the Nurse Practice Act. But I do believe that we need to do the baccalaureate. I hate to tell you this. I think you need to be master's prepared. And you can be master's prepared and be a staff nurse. It's just, you need to know why you're doing what you're doing.
Well, I definitely agree with that part 100%. This has been probably my most favorite interview. I got to be honest with you, Monica. Your energy and your stories and everything else. This was a fantastic interview.
Well,
And so
thank you.
Yeah, I mean,
Thank
really,
you.
Paul,
Yeah.
good call.
Paul made me do it. That's the whole thing. Paul made me do it.
I'm so glad I did too. Yeah.
I'm glad you did.
Oh, I enjoyed it, you guys. Really, thank you.
That was Monica Weisbrich, and we talked about a lot of things. Seriously, the evolution of surgery. There were some nuggets in there, Paul, that I had definitely never even heard of. I knew about the materials. I knew about not having plastics. But the one thing that Monica didn't talk about, and I gave her plenty of opportunity to do it, but she didn't take us up on it, was to give us some good old stories about you, Paul. No, seriously. I can see why you stuck with her throughout your career and why you see her as such a mentor. She has a great sense of humor. She's got an incredible level of competence, and she's also really seen not only surgery, but nursing as a profession really come about and become more organized. And she talked about things being not so structured and that they knew that there was room for improvement. And really, it's the nurses that she worked alongside with for so many years that really formalized nursing as a profession, and especially the improvements in surgery. And what a great get. Great job, Paul, for having Monica join us.
Well, I love Monica. I've known her name was one of the first names I heard when I worked in the operating room, even though she actually was the director at the hospital where I started, but she had left just a few months before I started there. So I always heard the name Monica, Monica, Monica. I didn't really meet her until about 10 years later. And I will tell you, she exceeded my expectations of what everybody else told me about her. She's just a terrific person. And she just scratched the surface in tonight's episode. There's so much more knowledge that she has that she could pass on to others. She didn't talk much about networking at this point, but Monica not only was involved in AORN, she also was one of the early members of the Association of California Nurse Leaders. She was president of the American Nurses Association of California. She's done it all. And I still, every day, get emails from her about the latest legislation on nursing in the state of California. She keeps up on everything. She knows all that's going on. So a really amazing person, and I'm so thankful that I've had such a long association with her.
Well, I'll tell you, Paul, you're going to find this as we continue to do this podcast. There's going to be guests that come on, and when we get done, we're going to say, well, we're going to have you back. You're going to have to come back on the show. There's so much more to talk about. It might be the first time we've said it here on the First Case podcast. It won't be the last. And I can definitely see having Monica back. Just want to thank her so much. That was an excellent interview. And that is going to do it for this week's show. But as a reminder, you can help support First Case by subscribing on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and Spotify. We'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review because your feedback is important to the show. And on behalf of Jeremy, Paul, and myself, thank you for listening to this episode of First Case.